So we've started the practice of metta, trying to build it up the way we'd light a fire, and using the kindling first of all with the loved person or the benefactor. And you may wonder why we're not really sending metta to ourselves yet, but at the same time you might notice that you're already sending metta to yourself simply by purifying the mind through this practice. Because when we generate metta, we're already undermining the hindrances, particularly hindrances of aversion, ill will, hostility, and the hindrances of craving too, because when we're contented inside with the metta practice, and when we can start to tune into the pleasant quality and the calming quality, we don't need to crave for things outside so much. We've got another source of happiness. And of course, every time that we do generate ill will or craving, we're harming ourselves first of all. Other people might get harmed as a result if that turns into unskillful behaviour or speech, but it always harms ourselves. And when you practice for a while, you'll notice that even when the thought of craving or aversion arises, you've already moved out of the present moment, out of the zone of contentment, if you like, and into looking elsewhere for happiness, or pushing away what's already arisen. Yeah? And there is no other place that we can find happiness than in this present moment. So the Buddha said there's nothing there's a greater source of happiness than our own well-trained mind, well-tamed or well-disciplined mind. I kind of don't like too much the word discipline and train, but it basically means through practicing, cultivating wholesome states. Yeah? And he says that for one who acts, speaks or acts with a pure mind, then happiness follows like a shadow that never leaves you. Isn't that lovely? Because even if something from the past comes up, some suffering, some painful thought, it's how we respond to it in the present that determines our future. So we can always use every opportunity to develop what Ajahn Brahm calls good mental Coma, or good meditation Coma, he sometimes calls it. So something arises because of the past, or because of even the very recent past, one thought leads to another. But if you can catch that and give that space between the knower and the known, so to speak, just to use that as a paradigm, and you can add in that space some kindness, some gentleness. I like to use the word armistice, making an armistice with your mind, because it literally means a temporary ceasefire or a temporary suspension of hostilities while an effort for lasting peace can be made. Which is very lovely, because of course we don't have lasting peace yet, but we can always temporarily stop the fight, stop the battle, stop the argument with reality. Yeah. So this is one of the benefits. And another benefit of practicing loving kindness towards the loved or the benefactor is, or towards anybody for that matter, is that you start to develop more energy in the mind. Yeah? And more energy leads to more mindfulness. It's one of the balas, or the strengths. I don't know how many of you are familiar with these sort of frameworks that we have in Buddhism, but there are 5 strengths, sometimes translated as the 5 friends. So we're already developing some of these friends, and the first one is confidence, sometimes translated as faith, but I like to think of it as, it's not a belief system. Buddhism, the Buddha's teachings were never sort of meant to be taken on faith, they were always meant to be verifiable. So we have a certain amount of confidence in the beginning, maybe through inspiration or through just, it sounds right, it feels right, it has the kind of taste of enlightenment, the taste of freedom, yeah? And this is enough to make us take that first step, and then as we take that step, we get a benefit. Then the confidence becomes verified little by little. So even now, while we're practicing the metta, we might not have the results of that metta just yet, but we have the confidence in our intention, the trust, that by planting these seeds, they will give rise to the flower of loving kindness. Yeah? And it will be beautiful. It will result in happiness. It will result in peace. And maybe even for others, because they will feel your kindness, your non-harm, your gentleness. And that will affect the community and hopefully the society that we live in. Yeah? So we have this confidence, first of all, and that gives rise to a certain amount of energy in the mind. Because we feel inspired to do something, we feel inspired to put it into action, and so energy starts to build. And then the next friend, it's usually a sequential thing. When the Buddha lists 5 factors, it's usually one leads to the next. So the energy leads into the mindfulness. And mindfulness and energy both have this element of happiness, Because when we're energized, we obviously have more, we're kind of more awake, we're more alive, and we can start to see beauty in things we normally don't notice. When you're very dull, it's easy. Even if you've got a delicious plate of food, you just kind of eat it and don't really know what you're doing. Or maybe if you're watching TV at the same time, it just gets shuffled down and you don't really notice the taste, or you don't stop to consider all the people that have put their love into the food. But here, when you start to get this mindfulness, everything starts to taste really delicious, much more than the sum total of its ingredients. Yeah? And so this mindfulness then, in the sequence of the 5 friends, leads into stillness, samadhi. Yeah? We have to have strong mindfulness to be able to overcome some of the hindrances that block us from entering those deeper states of peace and stillness. So mindfulness, as it grows, becomes stiller and stiller. So stillness is not a dull state, it's anything but a dull state. It's actually an awakening of the mind, not full awakening. I don't like to misuse those terms or in any misleading way. But we're becoming more content inside, brighter, more peaceful, so the mind doesn't need to kind of move around so much. It starts to calm down and settle where it is. And this leads to the stillness, and from there to the wisdom. Yeah? So stillness is the cause for seeing things as they really are. So this is the whole trajectory of the path that we're on, using a slightly different framework again. But just to say that, by practicing loving kindness to others, we're practicing it to ourselves. We're already benefiting ourselves. We're so interconnected that there's really very little difference. And sometimes we think we don't have love for ourselves, but there's a nice story in the suttas that indicates, well, I think it indicates, how we do actually care about ourselves. And it was the story of Queen Malika, who was the wife of King Pasenadi. And he was sort of interested in Buddhism, but not really. In fact, he was a little bit jealous of his wife's interest. And one day I think she was a very good meditator. And one day he saw her looking out of the window, and the Buddha was walking along the road. Can you imagine? A radiant Buddha walking along with his monks and nuns. And she looked outside with such devotion and such love, with a look of absolute adoration towards the Buddha and respect, basically. Nothing more than this, nothing strange. But the king saw her, and being her husband, he felt quite jealous, and he was like, "What are you doing, Malika? Looking at the Buddha like that?" He said, "Who do you love more, me or the Buddha?" So apparently in those days in India that was a very loaded question, because if the queen said that she didn't love her husband, she'd be beheaded, or kind of at the very least thrown out, and he would take another wife. But she was a very small lady, and she said, "More than both of you, I love myself." And there's a lot of truth in that, because we think we love another, but really we're projecting our own feelings onto another person. What we really love is the way they make us feel. Yeah? We're loving the feeling we have inside when we look at that being. We're loving the feeling we have inside when we hang around our teachers, or when our teachers give us a glimpse of our own potential. That's what we love. When people put us down and say, "You don't have any potential," we don't love that feeling at all. So then we project it onto that person and we say, "Hey, that person's really cruel, really mean, they don't like me." But really we just don't like the sensation in our body. That's what it comes down to. And the more you practice with this body awareness, the more you realize that. And when you can just see these different sensations as like winds passing, through the sky, they're literally passing as they enter. They're not sort of staying and then they go. They're actually in transit the whole time. These little fleeting sensations just passing through. So why should we grasp them? And in a way, it's when we grasp onto these things. Sometimes we like to grasp onto our suffering and on our craving, because it gives us a sense of being solid, being somebody. And one of the scariest things in meditation is when that sense of self starts to become very fine, very thin, and you start to feel you're disappearing. This can give rise sometimes to fear or panic. Actually it's a very pleasant feeling. But sometimes we're so attached to this sense of me as the one who suffers, or me as the one who's never good enough. Even a negative identity is preferable to not knowing who we are. Yeah. So sometimes we're quite attached to that. And Ajahn Brahm talks about some of the conferences he's been to on trauma and loss. And there was a lady there who had lost her daughter in very tragic circumstances to one of the serial killers of that time in Australia, I think it was. And apparently she went around every conference, on grief and loss, and she was pretty famous, and she'd talk about her story, which, we have to talk about the pain, first of all. But it had become almost like an identity, and when Ajahn Brahm went there, he talked about letting go of pain, letting go of the grief, and moving on from that, finding forgiveness in that. And she was very upset with him and went to him and said, "How dare you take away my grief, my pain?" Because sometimes we're more at ease with that than we realise. And it's actually scary to let it go. Yeah. So, do we love ourselves? I mean, look at different ways in which you're helping yourself right now. You've come here, you've brought yourself to the barn. Is that for you or for others? I mean, it's sort of for others. We sort of say, well, it'll be good for others, but it's because, you know that that's in your interest, and you wanted to come here to purify your mind. You had a sense that this would lead you to happiness. When you choose the food at lunchtime, are you choosing the food that makes you sick or that you really dislike? I hope not. Normally we choose the food which we like, which is going to make us feel well, which is going to be good for us and nourish us. So there's many, many ways in which we actually really do care for ourselves, but at the same time we are our most intimate friend, or sometimes adversary. And so we know our own weaknesses, we know our own failings, if you like, if you want to see it that way. We know our own inner demons, right? And so sometimes these can get exaggerated in our mind. Actually, they're not the whole truth, but we're very sensitive to that, much more so than we are to those inner, difficulties that other people experience. We don't feel other people suffering in quite the same way. We don't see their sort of shadow side or the way they really think about themselves when they're falling asleep. We don't see that, and so it tends to get exaggerated in our mind. But in fact, we do have a sense of knowing our strengths, knowing our, in a realistic way, and being able to celebrate with our successes as well. We do have that, and just to help me with that, because I tend to be quite a perfectionist. That's one of my inner tyrants, and it's probably the biggest one. And so I'm always sort of wondering, is it going to be good enough? And if it's not, then maybe I won't be loved. This is the problem with the tyrant. Like, there's something in that perfectionism that's actually beautiful. There's a real, genuine wish to be of service and to do well and to give something of real benefit to the world. So there's something there that's lovely, but there's a shadow side, which is the kind of, if I don't do well, maybe I won't be loved, or maybe I can't accept myself because I don't live up to my own expectation, And how high we have these expectations towards ourselves, just so much higher than we have them towards anyone else. If people could see the way we talk to ourselves, if you put the words or the thoughts or even just the sentiments we have on a screen and show it to other people, they think, my goodness, this person's really mean. We'd never take those thoughts out and spread them around or tell them to someone else in relation to someone else. But with ourselves, we're quite exacting and demanding. And so one thing that I've done, at the advice of my teacher, is quite against the grain, but it's to collect little messages of praise and appreciation, or let's say gratitude and appreciation, and put them all in like a document. So since I started this project, and since I started giving Dhamma reflections and things, which I never like to talk about as teaching, I think of it more as a sharing, because it is actually, like, it just comes out because it's in relation to, it's subconscious, in relation to the energy and the safety and the space, the feeling of being held. So it's actually a kind of, it's created amongst us all, but the words come out of my mouth at this moment. So I put together this list, and I've got all these beautiful comments, and in a way it's quite nice because at least it goes against the grain. It's not that I necessarily believe it, but I think when we can get away from identifying with, say, our performance or whatever, we can look at it from a different perspective, just in terms of, is it benefiting others? Am I able to benefit others? And find a lot of joy in that, So I decided quite early on, even if everybody hates it, if one person benefits, that's good enough. Because imagine, just to bring one person benefit in life, no matter how we do it. Today it was very beautiful after lunch, just seeing everybody use their special skills to, it was before lunch and continued after lunch, I think. Some people were like stitching little feet on foot towels. Some people were making some banana muffins. two of you are very beautifully putting my lunch together with so much loving kindness and care, and it definitely tasted more than its sum total of ingredients. And just to see, everybody doing whatever it was that felt like an offering from their heart, and to see how that kind of blended into this beautiful community spirit. Even David was outside doing the wood, and he got in. I said, "Oh, you came in from the wild outdoors into this cozy space," and he just said, "I feel great, coming in after that. I feel so happy." And yeah, you are somebody I know quite well who has a great sense of service. So take it in and don't feel embarrassed. So we have to learn to speak kindly to ourselves, speak kindly to others, and really be able to take the praise and appreciation in a way that uplifts us and helps us to be of service, right? We don't have to identify it with it and make it a part of our sense of self, but just, use these experiences to be of service in the world. So I wanted to share a little bit about something that happened to me just before the Rains retreat, because this was quite unexpected, and also just showed me, I guess, how much I value my life without even realising it. Because before the Rains retreat, which starts every July, there were about 20 days to go. And my mum had been to see me in Oxford about a month previously, and she'd noticed that one of the moles on my arms looked quite big, but it was still kind of the way it had always been, just maybe slightly bigger. I could concede that. So I said, okay, never mind, I'll check it out when I'm in Australia, because Australia's, they're experts on these things. But then one of my best friends came over, and while she was with me, it started to change, very suddenly, became red, became swollen, and then the black bits started to get blacker, and I suddenly thought, ooh, this is not good. So fortunately, because of the project and the support that I'm getting from the Trust, I was in a position to go quickly and have a private assessment of this. And they said, almost within a few hours, they were very kind, and they sped up the results, and they told me. The lady actually stayed later after work for me to get back to Oxford. She stayed late so that she could phone me when I got back, which was so amazing. And she told me, yeah, it's a melanoma. And I was like, okay, fine, you sort of take it quite well because you expect it. So I was like, fine, I knew it was anyway. But then I had a weekend on my own, and during that weekend I went through a whole range of feelings, from sort of actual trembling, I'd be working at the computer feeling fine, stand up, and then somewhere in the back of your mind, it's just like a death reflection, this could be serious, right? And no other kind of death reflection had given me such a visceral sense of that. But, I would stand up and the whole body would just be like, ooh, straight down. And it was very interesting, and that would be interspersed with periods of a real sort of sense of heightened awareness and actually a feeling of love, just pure love, towards others and also from others. I think Anna came round during that time, and a couple of other people came round, and when we were meditating, it was just no messing around at all. It just felt like the only thing to do was to bathe myself in love, and I could really receive that as well from the other people in the room. And I just felt so appreciative, I guess, and aware of the gift that my life is. And until this happened, it was, I suppose I tend to focus on that it's hard work, that it's quite demanding, that I'm tired a lot of the time. And although I know it's, I'm doing something beneficial, that's not always the first thing in my mind. But at this time, I actually had the word exquisite came to my mind. And it was as though I saw my whole life, as a sort of movie in a way. And I just thought, it's been exquisite. And it's just such a strange word to come to mind, but it was it really surprised me. It really surprised me. Because I guess I realised that I'd lived a life aligned to the deepest and purest of my intentions as best I could, and that I was in a position to be of benefit to myself and others. And I also realised that I wouldn't drop the project should I only have a limited time left to live. I thought that it would be just like, oh, forget that, that sort of side stuff, that service, I just want to focus on my liberation. But I didn't feel that way at all. I actually felt like I would want to see this continue for the benefit of others in the future. And that was just as important in a way as my own practice. In fact, not separate at all. So that was really surprising, and I think sometimes it's not until we have those kind of scares. In the end it was okay, and I had it taken off and it hadn't spread and then they took a bigger piece, so I got a really nice looking scar, like a real tough forest nun now. the real business. And it's good it's not on my face, because it would be like probably cut off your muscles, I think, and not, it'd be awful. You wouldn't be able to smile. It'd be like, ooh. But yeah, so I mean, I'm kind of pleased for the scar, because it reminds me of just how you don't know what's going on inside your body, you don't know. And even if you're perfectly healthy, you could walk out of here and, sorry to say, but the train could fall off the tracks. It's very close to the sea. Or, you could be involved in an accident, or a loved one could be involved in an accident, or somebody could be struggling and you didn't know about it. People commit suicide. I mean, as a monastic, these things are very close to the bone, because we chant every week for people who are struggling, and there's a whole long list of people with all sorts of cancers and stress and depression, and this is just part of life. So just to really balance these kind of little trivial kind of irritations, like voices of the inner critic that tell us we're not good enough and try to undermine what we're doing and undermine our good work and tell us we should be better than we are, or just take us to task and say, work harder, These are just irritations, really. And I think when you have a bigger perspective, you can see it in context, and you can focus more easily on the things you are able to bring to this world and really rejoice in that. Because it's all about what you put your attention on, that kind of grows. So if you put your attention on the negatives, then you're bringing those into the centre of your mind, so to speak, and that's what you will notice more and more and more. Whereas when you put your attention on, the good things that you're doing and your general inclination, it doesn't have to be anything that's manifest in sort of bricks and mortar, it can be just your general kind of direction in life, then we're all doing incredibly well, we're all very, very good, very kind, gentle, good-hearted people. So I think it's really important to remember this. So that was, I've written down loads of little stories that I could tell you here, but let's skip, because time tends to fly, on to the mind a little bit. I mean, one thing also I did want to say just for today and tomorrow is to treat your body well as well, because I think often our body's just tired and we kind of feel we need to push it and get it to do more, get it to sit up straight, etc., etc. And actually, I mean, for myself, as I said yesterday, there's a kind of chronic tiredness, and I could sleep for 2 weeks if I had the chance. And in the past I worried about that. Like even recently I went to Gaia House after the last retreats that we organised with Ajahn Brahm over here. And it's 9 days of kind of being constantly on the move, giving teachings. He gives teachings, I just sit there and poke him when he's going over time. But it takes quite a lot of work from my side as well. And I had a week's retreat at Gaia House, and I got there completely exhausted. But because I don't take that personally anymore, I just realised the body's tired, so let it rest. It's not a personal failing. It's just cause and effect. If you've been working too hard, especially brain-wise, and meeting, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people who all say, "Do you remember me?" And I'm like, even the question is really hard work, because then you have to go through all your memories and try and place them. So my head was spinning, and I got there and I just thought, okay, I've got a nice bed, I've got a cosy room, I'm going to put my meditation cushion in my room, and I'm going to rest as much as I want. And I slept a lot after breakfast, after lunch, full 8 hours at night, and for about 2 days I did that, and just meditated a couple of hours, but kind of drowsy meditation. But then at some point my body started to feel really warm and tingly, because I'd been treating it nicely, and it was as if it was saying, thank you for looking after me. And as soon as that was, it felt satisfied and it felt rested, then my meditation was there. So it's there for you. It's just, we try and push it too much, and we expect so much and make so many demands that our body should be this way and that way, our mind should be this way and that way. And you're just wasting energy, basically, fighting these things. Yeah. So for the mind, I wanted to get a bit more into compassion. I mean, the first thing is to just learn to relax the mind and like let the mind take the lead on things. So rather than pushing our mind and saying, right, I've got to follow the schedule, I've got to be in the hall at this time, I've got to sit on a chair or whatever, lie on the floor. You don't even have to lie on the floor, you know, you can sit on a chair if that feels good. It's really up to you. So ask the body and don't just be a creature of habit. You know, it's like asking, so body, how long do you want to sit? Like, and then you look in your mind. Okay, mind, so what do you feel like doing right now, you know? And if you find some difficult emotion there, it's like, okay, so now I'm experiencing something difficult. So how can I be with this? Like, what does this need? How can I soothe myself? You know, so ask yourself these questions and not just kind of going for the meditation method that's offered or for the thing that you're normally used to doing. Like, give yourself some space, first of all, and listen in, yeah? So that's what we mean by listening in. And then the other thing that can sometimes be an obstacle to this self-love and self-compassion is a sense of like guilt. And this comes up with some people when they're getting into like nice meditation. I'm sure it gets in there with me as well. It doesn't completely break the meditation down, but it definitely sort of keeps it at a level. It keeps it from going deeper sometimes because I feel like, oh yeah, this happiness is good, you know, that's sort of enough. Because you kind of feel like somewhere in the mind there's a negotiation, like, okay, I deserve this much, but I maybe don't deserve more than that, you know? And so we don't really linger and really let ourselves settle into it as fully as we could. And so in the mind, you know, it's sometimes good to notice that there might be some kind of guilt or some kind of sense of not deserving, not being worthy, and just to have a look at where that might be coming from, you know, whether you need to do some self-forgiveness. So there was, I mean, it's a bit of I find quite a painful story, but I want to tell a story that I read in a book by Desmond Tutu and his daughter, which was called I think it's the Book of Forgiveness. Yeah, someone's read it, yeah. And there were all kinds of stories about really horrific things that, you know, had happened and about how they made this reconciliation, what was it called? The Truth and Reconciliation Act, where people were able to come and confess the way that they basically murdered mostly black people in South Africa at the time of apartheid and come and have amnesty. So they were able to come there, tell the truth about it and be forgiven. And people were forgiving the most incredible things that happened to their own partners or husbands or children, you know. But the thing that really struck me in this book was kind of the tragedy of not being able to speak the truth about something. And it was a young girl of about 17. And what happened to her was that I think she just passed a driving license. And one day she asked her dad if he could give her a lift to school or to college or whatever, wherever she was going, because she wasn't quite confident. And he said, oh, I'm tired today, I just want to sleep in a bit longer. So she thought, okay, well, never mind, I'll take the car and drive myself. And she was driving, I think, in Sydney and going up this hill. And she got to the top of the hill and suddenly she was shocked and horrified because she saw a lady walking across the zebra crossing. She hadn't noticed it. And she saw straight into this woman's eyes this look of absolute horror. And she tried to swerve, but basically it was too late and she ran over this lady who was about 70 years old, I think. And this image stayed with her, you know, for years and years and years, mainly because she obviously was very, very shaken. But first thing that happened was she went to the police station and they, I guess, took pity on her because she was a young girl and they didn't want her to go to prison. So they asked her, how fast were you driving? The speed limit was 35 miles or 35, I think it's miles in Australia. How fast were you going? She said, I was going too fast, it was about 45. And they stopped the recording button and they asked her a second time and they said, so, what's the speed limit? It's 35. And how fast were you going? I was going too fast, I was going 45. And then at that point the policeman got quite irritated and he stopped it again. And he let's try that again. And then she suddenly thought, what's going on here? Are they trying to get me to lie? Or what is going on? And he asked the question again. And she paused when he said, so how fast were you going? And she said, about 35. And then he allowed the recording to continue. He said, okay, good. So she knew she'd lied and she'd been forced into it in a way, in a very difficult situation. So this was the first thing that happened. And so she wasn't able to receive the appropriate, in a way, punishment. I mean, I don't like that word, and I don't think that's the right word for the sort of for the system. But perhaps it would have helped her to feel that, you know, there was a chance to grieve and accept and acknowledge what she'd done and have some kind of rehabilitation from that. But what happened then was she went back to her family, and the father, of course, felt incredibly guilty, and the whole family was really shaken up. And the mother decided to pass an edict that night to say that they would never talk about this again in the family from then on. And because of this, everything fell apart. You know, this poor girl had no opportunity to talk about what happened, to tell the story, and to name the hurt. These are the first two stages of forgiveness discussed in the book. You have to tell the story, you have to acknowledge what happened, and feel the pain of that, you know, really meet that pain in order to forgive it, you know, in order to make peace and find compassion and move on. So she was denied this, and no one was allowed to speak about it, so she suffered alone. And it became like living in a big lie. You know, she couldn't talk about it at school, with the teachers, with anybody. And she said her father left the home after about 3 months, and he turned to alcohol and died 10 years later. The whole family were basically torn apart, and eventually she ended up in England. And she said it took 30 years to be able to forgive herself, because she had to find a way to go through that process away from her family, you know, where they're denied that telling of the truth and that reconciliation. And I just found this the most poignant and really upsetting story in the whole book, but also very powerful as an indicator of the importance of truth and the importance of being able to just face the reality of what happened. And it was years and years later that she found, I'm not sure how many years later it was, but she managed to get in contact with the family of the lady who died. The lady was about 70. I mean, you know, whatever, I don't know if that makes it better or worse, but the family had actually forgiven her almost immediately. You know, they hadn't held on to it for a moment because they knew it was an accident. And so all these years she'd been carrying that, and what a waste of time. I mean, in the end it was very beautiful, because obviously she's in this book for a reason, and that's because she's developed her own system of kind of counselling people who've, you know, made mistakes and who are looking for forgiveness, self-forgiveness or forgiveness of others. And so she's put that experience to the service of others, which is very beautiful. But I just wanted to mention it as a process, you know, that we can do for ourselves. And also to indicate that probably none of us have done anything so obviously harmful to others. I mean, even though it was an accident, you know, most of the things we do are accidents. We don't really mean to hurt others, you know, with what we say or do. And so surely we can forgive ourselves. So these are the steps, you know, first of all, just telling the story and becoming clear about what happened and not pushing it under the carpet into the subconscious realms of our minds. And then actually, feeling that hurt and giving it space. So even on this Metta retreat, even though we're filling the mind with the beautiful thoughts and the positive perceptions, please also give yourself the space, like when grief comes up or when tenderness, vulnerability, any kind of insecurity, when any of those other emotions come up, give them the space, because it's in that space that the healing can happen. Yeah, there has to be a container, a space. And you can fill that space with kindness and compassion. Yeah? So self-compassion is really important, and these inner tyrannical voices are the opposite of self-compassion. They're the voices that try to really harm ourselves and cause sort of self-destructive behaviours, maladaptive behaviours sometimes, and tend to undermine our sense of self-worth and happiness, positive feelings, you know, around ourselves and around others. So sometimes we have to substitute those thoughts with different thoughts, and this is one of the Buddha's first recommendations in the suttas about dealing with unwholesome thoughts. And he separates thoughts into two categories. He says on the one hand you have thoughts which are based on non-harming, so if you like gentleness, non-ill will, which is metta, and letting go, thoughts of letting go. And just to describe what letting go means, it's given as the opposite of sense desire. So it means a kind of moving away from the realm of the five senses, moving towards something inward, some kind of inner peace. Yeah. So it's the opposite movement of craving. So it's letting go, being free, freeing the mind from its wants, from its desires. And then on the other hand, and this is the Buddha speaking before he was a Buddha, he said he noticed in his own mind there were these two types of thoughts. One were the 3 right intentions, it's the equivalent of the second factor of the Noble Path. And on the other hand were the opposite, so thoughts of cruelty, thoughts of ill will, and thoughts of sense desire. And I'll just read a little bit what he says about that because it's very lovely. So, this comes with an awareness, so we have to first be aware of the kind of thoughts that we have in our mind and notice, are these harmful or are these helpful? Yeah? And we choose the helpful ones. So the Buddha straight away is giving you permission for that. He's not saying you have to dwell on the unhelpful ones. He's saying, just choose the ones that lead to happiness. So the next thing you need to look at and examine is, where are they leading? If I continue these negative thoughts, are they leading to happiness? Are they leading to liberation? Are they leading to more suffering? So this is what he does. Oh yeah, I love this. So first of all he said, whatever somebody frequently thinks and ponders upon, that will become the inclination of their mind. If one frequently thinks and ponders upon thoughts of sensual desire, one has abandoned the thoughts of letting go or renunciation to cultivate the thought of sensual desire, and then the mind inclines to thoughts of sensual desire. If one frequently thinks and ponders upon thoughts of ill will, then one has abandoned thoughts of metta to, it's got ... to cultivate thoughts of ill will. If one frequently thinks and ponders upon thoughts of cruelty, they've abandoned thoughts of non-cruelty or thoughts of gentleness or non-harming to cultivate the thought of cruelty, and then the mind inclines to thoughts of cruelty. So this is already interesting because he's saying that if you actually keep thinking a certain way, you're actually cultivating that kind of thought. So it's like you're watering the flowers, or weeds actually. If it's thoughts of cruelty and harming, you're watering the weeds in the mind. Yeah? And you're creating a habit which becomes your kind of disposition, your character. So then he has the positive thoughts. So there he says, as I abided, diligent, ardent and resolute, a thought of letting go or a thought of renunciation arose in me. I understood that this thought of renunciation has arisen. This does not lead to my affliction or to others' affliction, or to the affliction of both. Okay, so we're thinking about, again, to all as to oneself, we're thinking about everybody's benefit. It might not harm others, but it might be harming you. So don't do it. Or it might not be harming you, but it's harming others, even to think that way. So we want to have thoughts that do not cause harm to either ourselves or others. So he's thinking, it does not lead to my affliction or to others' affliction or the affliction of both, but it aids wisdom, it does not cause difficulties, and it leads to nibbana. Even if I think and ponder upon this thought for a whole night, even for a day or a night and a day, I see nothing to fear from it. So those kind of thoughts that we're having in our metta meditation are not to be avoided, like they're very, very wholesome, and they're actually watering flowers in our minds, they're cultivating the positive qualities. And so we can think that way as much as we like, to a certain point, because then he says, but with excessive thinking and pondering, I might tire my body. And when the body's tired, the mind becomes strained. And when the mind is strained, it's far from stillness. So, the next stage is that he steadied the mind internally, quieted it, brought it to singleness, and stilled it. Why is that? So that the mind should not become strained. So there's actually quite a lot in that sutta, but I like it because it's showing you how there are different types of thoughts and we can learn to differentiate them and choose. We have some control over choosing what kind of thoughts are going to be helpful, and also realizing that we can incline our mind that way and frequently think in those ways, and yet eventually if you want to go into stillness, even those thoughts can be let go of. So that's kind of what we're doing in the practice of the metta. We're starting with a thought and then we're leaving bigger and bigger spaces. So as the mind starts to incline towards the meaning of metta, we can actually back off with the thoughts and just leave a bit of a gap and start to flow with that feeling, start to tune up with the emotional tone or the emotional quality, the warmth, the goodwill, the happiness that comes and the peace that comes with metta. And then when that starts to wane again you invite a thought or you offer a thought, and just to keep on stimulating the feeling of metta. Yeah, so we're pointing the mind a certain way and trying to bring up these thoughts of metta. And as the mind gets stiller, you find that you maybe not only can leave bigger gaps, but you might also reduce the sentences that you choose. So for example, with me, the first one is usually, may I be happy, and then may I be free, may I be healed, may I be at peace. But after a while that starts to fade and I just say happy, free, healed. And so it just becomes single words, just to keep my mind pointed in the right direction. And this was really great for me in Perth last year after I had the operation, because somehow I knew this would happen. I went there and happened to get an infection in my wound just as it was about to heal. It became really swollen and inflamed and it looked very dodgy. So I had this big thing on my arm, and the main thing was that I didn't really want to leave the retreat and have to go to the doctors and take antibiotics. But anyway, so Ajahn Brahm just said, do lots of metta. So I did some metta practice, and I think he was also thinking that there is this really strong healing power in metta. But the idea is not to use it for the sake of healing, but healing can be a side effect of the metta. So I went to my room, and as I was saying before, when there's an actual need to practice it, you don't mess around. So I just sat down and let the mind calm bit by bit and gradually introduce these phrases. So at first, the mind can be kind of agitated. It can be a little bit of effort to have to keep saying them, and you feel like, oh, it's not doing anything, it's just lots of words. But let it settle. Until the point where the metta was flowing quite nicely, and it just went to the single words, and I was just sitting there really at peace, and looked at my clock, and it was like 3.5 hours. I was like, wow, that was amazing. I didn't even realise the time passed, because it was just getting into this lovely flow. And I don't think I especially directed it to that area or whatever, and I came out of the meditation, I had a look, and it looked the same. So I was like, oh, part of me would have been bargaining with it a little bit. But actually, the next day it was quite significantly better, and some sort of healing corner had turned. I mean, it could have timed with the antibiotics kicking in, who knows, but it could also be that it just gave that little boost to the immune system and to the mind, because at least for those hours I wasn't worried about it, I wasn't really concerned about it. I was just creating what we call good mental Coma, and also, by doing that, as the Buddha says, you're not straining the body, you're not exhausting the body, you're giving it every possibility to heal itself. And the body doesn't know how to heal itself. So these kind of practices are not practices of fabricating. They're not actually like creating a kind of barrier, like a veneer over the reality at all. These are actually stages of less fabrication, if that makes sense. Like we're doing less. It looks at first as though we're doing something and the doer is involved, and maybe it's a little bit artificial, but actually because we're undermining our habitual tendencies to interfere and to find fault and all the rest, we're actually moving into much subtler areas of the mind. And so, we're going back to a kind of natural state, if you like, of peace. And in that state, it has been proven by many scientific tests and studies that when you do have a lot of compassion, it boosts your immune system, it boosts your health, it obviously boosts relationships, and it certainly boosts your relationship with yourself. So, learning to just work with our own mind and substitute those unwholesome thoughts with something more positive can be a really powerful step towards self-compassion. So I would encourage this, and I'm just sneaking little bits of compassion and metta towards ourselves into the meditation, but I wanted to give a few more little hints about how to work with your own mind and how to be kind to yourself over the next day or so, because tomorrow we'll be mostly in silence, so you'll be with your own mind quite a lot. So please be gentle, and if the tyrant takes hold and it doesn't work to substitute, another method you can do is actually confront the tyrant. For example, my perfectionism might come up, and then I'll say, well, hello perfectionism, very nice to see you there. I know you're trying to protect me. I know you're trying to, get the best, and it comes from a really good intention. There's a lot of good in that, but I just don't really need you anymore, I don't need to be perfect to be loved. and tell myself that. Ajahn Brahm has this beautiful quote that I picked up recently listening to one of his talks. It says something like, don't ever think that you're special. We're all so ordinary, and that's what makes us special.
Mm-hmm.
And I really like that, because we are. And why should we feel that we need to be perfect? You know, we're all just as ordinary as each other, and yet very unique. And that's enough. That's good enough. So we don't have to be special, and we don't have to be specially bad either. So don't think that your tyrant's worse than everybody else's tyrant, because it's not so special either. It's just a conditioned tendency that you picked up from parents, schooling, education systems. You know, they don't belong to us, these tyrants. They're not actually things. It's just a kind of paradigm in order to talk about a phenomena of mental patterning, but it's not a thing, it's a conditioning. And any condition can be reconditioned, it can be dismantled, taken apart. So don't buy into those thoughts, yeah? Just notice which direction they're leading you. Is it leading to wisdom? Is it leading to peace? Is it leading to happiness or not? And then substitute with a thought of kindness, a thought of non-harm, non-ill will, gentleness, yeah? And letting go. Because none of this really belongs to us anyway. You might as well let it go. Good. So that's all I want to say for now. If there's anything that's unclear, or that if anybody has a quick question or comment, I can take one. Yeah. So feeling good about the silent day tomorrow? Or you're in the moment? Okay, no problem so far, that's great. So, would you like to take a 5-minute break or have a stretch, and then we'll do some guided meditation?